Good. Now that's working. I'm just going to put up a holding screen for a while, if that's okay.
Yeah, of course.
Senior, you're in Copenhagen?
I am, yeah.
And you're
And
in Cologne, Leon?
I am in my office, yes. Still, I mean, maybe the last couple of days before I disappeared to Zurich. Yeah. What about you?
I'm in Amsterdam.
And then are you locked into your house or?
We're not locked, no. It's just that they've started closing shops early.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Is that a new COVID measure?
Yes.
Uh-huh.
They're doing more lockdowns. The shops now have to close at 8 o'clock in the evening, and only people with vaccination are allowed in certain places. And they've had riots complaining about all this in Rotterdam and The Hague, and people burning things down.
My goodness.
Yeah. It's all a bit.
Yeah, unpleasant, unfortunate. No words for it.
No.
Yeah, they now have this scary word in the German media discussion, which is, or the scary concept, which is endless loop. We are in this endless loop, you know.
Yes.
That's a very scary concept. I haven't heard of that. That's
Yeah.
very fitting. I mean, the point is we should not be in an endless loop, right? If that's where we're heading, we need to have a new way of dealing with the situation.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. Here the discussion is that the vaccination rates are just too low, and then if they don't get better, then yeah, it's the endless loop.
It's the endless loop. But there are two sides to one thing is too low vaccination rates, and we also have that here, although we have quite high vaccination rates, but they're just not high enough. So we need to get the last 10% of the population also vaccinated.
Yeah.
And but in addition to that, there's also a lot of the contagion goes through people who are vaccinated, and the vaccinations don't last as long as we had hoped. So we have a lot of contagion in the part of the population who's vaccinated, and because they're vaccinated, they're not careful.
Yeah.
And in the end, it ends up with someone who cannot take it.
Yeah. That I perceive the same thing. It's
yeah.
In
Hello,
this context,
Panicos.
Yeah.
Hello,
Hi,
everyone.
Panicos.
Good to see you.
Yeah, I haven't seen you in a while.
Yeah. I just had my vaccine, actually. I just caught you talking about.
Oh,
I had my booster just now, like 4 hours ago. And I was
Congratulations.
Am I all right? I think I'm still okay. But if
you're okay and you're not growing green ears.
No, they put a microchip in me or something.
That's the third microchip you have now.
Yes. And I'm growing a tail also. Yeah.
If you want,
I think you're absolutely right, Signe. I find myself being more relaxed. It's moral hazard of a safety net, isn't it?
It is.
With any safety net, there's moral hazard. And
There's
the same is true with the vaccine.
Yeah.
We behave a little bit less, even if we're still conscious of it, deep down, we just feel like a little bit more secure. So we inadvertently forget our masks and etc. Yeah. So
because I heard this, there was a study of parents home with sick kids. And they compared parents who were vaccinated to parents who were not vaccinated, and they found that being vaccinated only protects you. It's only a 20% lower probability of being of catching COVID if you're vaccinated compared to non-vaccinated, which is a very small gain you get from being. But I think that I don't know if they can control for the fact that vaccinated parents probably are much closer to their kids. They're not careful.
Yeah.
So I would bet there is a difference in behavior. If you're not vaccinated, you might be more careful to use masks and
Yes, there's selection there. There is I don't know what they do, the epidemiologists with these samples, because obviously there must be a lot of good statistical work to be done, actually, right?
There's so much statistical work to be done. Yeah.
Yeah, and bad. I mean, it's but I haven't bothered. I'm sort of gone past my academic retirement age now, so I feel like I can sort of watch others do these things rather than because other people, there's been so much money going into research. So many people have been putting in research grants. I mean, in the UK at least. And you know, people getting grants a lot more easily if they just simply research all these data sets.
Yeah.
And I suspect a lot of this research would be rubbish. Because there's been, like, you know, the government throwing money at the problem and just hoping for the best, basically.
But it has to be done as much as possible to the sooner we can look at all these data, that we can maybe inform some of the approaches we'll have over the next few years for this endless loop. I mean, if it's going to be the next 3, 4, 5, 6, 8 years, the more we can learn how to handle it, the better.
But what I'm saying is that not all studies are going to give either reliable or sort of consistent results. So because the more of these you do, the more you're going to get inconsistencies across and unreliable, and, you know, have they control for the right things or not? I mean, it's inevitable, right? It's
yes, it is.
But anyway, let's hope those who look at it are choosing the right, or rather that policy is informed by the best studies. And I mean, that's what we can hope for.
Yeah.
Hello, Karen. Welcome.
Good morning. Good afternoon.
Good morning to you.
Very nice to. I wish I were, of course, joining you in person, but it's been. I think it's going to be a little bit of a while before we're able to do that. Sad to say.
I think so. Anyway.
Yeah.
At least we've got this technology.
At least, Who knew?
Yes, exactly.
Exactly. It's been very lively in the States with the Powell renomination, really raising, I hope, somewhat more informed than usual discussion about exactly the topic of our meeting today, which is the role of the Fed and its policy dominance.
Yes, I can imagine. So how was this received?
I think to say predictably. The markets overreacted. I think a lot of this has been sort of idiotic on the market side, but what do I know? And the progressives were predictably unhappy. For what it's worth, what we told our clients is I think one needs to see what it was that Jay Powell and the White House promised the very progressive chairman of the Senate Banking Committee that Fed policy would look like on climate risk, on CBDC, on an array of not monetary policy issues. A lot of deals got done, and it'll be very interesting to see what they are.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah.
Hello, Annie.
Hi, I'm going to be live tweeting it if that's okay with everybody.
Yeah, and
depending
I think
on
we should be live on Facebook. Are we?
We are live on Facebook, and I've just shared the link on Twitter as well, so that people, and I've tagged everybody on that, apart from Leon, who isn't on Twitter.
How come?
I'm very old-fashioned.
Oh,
decidedly so. I'm not on Facebook.
I'm also not on Twitter, except my organization has put me on Twitter, but I'm not there myself.
Well, I've tagged you in the hope that your organization will share it then as well.
Yeah, they probably will.
I'm not Meta, please, Meta. I'm anti-Meta, but I am on Twitter, so we'll find out how that all works out.
So you're actually referring to Meta now and not Facebook.
Well, I didn't like Facebook either, but somehow now that they've become Meta, to me, they're even more appalling.
Yeah, they're scary.
Yeah, that, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Galactic, I don't know what they are.
Yeah, but I very much hope we turn to Jay Powell later in the discussion, because it's somehow an interesting case, it seems to me.
And up to you. Happy to do it.
Up to Joe, I guess.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, we'll get to that.
Hi, everybody.
Hello.
Hi, Alex.
Hi,
Hello,
Alex.
Hello, Alex.
Good to see you all.
Good to hear you.
We'll give it another couple of minutes.
I live in an old part of Washington, and they are replacing at least for the United States, an old part of Washington, and they're replacing the 120-year-old water pipes around the neighborhood. For the moment, it's quiet, and I fortunately know where the mute button is, so I hope it will stay quiet. But they've been pounding away for actually a year and a half.
I just spent 4 years in Washington, came back in 19. So where are you in Washington?
I live very close to Rock Creek Park in a neighborhood called Forest Hills.
Nice.
Yeah. Very nice living. It's a nice way to live in the city. A big problem we have is foxes waking us up in the middle of the night.
Yeah.
We used to have deer.
Oh, God, we have
plants.
so many deer everywhere. Where did you live?
In Hillendale, up in Georgetown. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Now deer are everywhere. There's even a couple of coyotes in the park.
Interesting.
Gosh, I thought we had a lot of animals with a few foxes in Zurich, but Washington seems to be much richer on that front. Huh?
As I said, Washington is nice. Most people who visit don't know there's a huge national park that runs through the middle of the city. It turns into a much smaller thread when you get closer to Georgetown and the river. But up where I live, it's about 2.5 miles wide, and it's a long park. So it really and it runs all the way up to northern Maryland. So it has we've had bear, and it's wonderful because I also only live a 20-minute walk to the metro. So it's a very nice way to live in the city.
I used to go running there. I have very good memories of Rock Creek Park. Yeah.
Yeah, and Rock Creek is beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
The creek itself is particularly after a big storm, quite majestic.
Chair, you're on mute.
Sorry?
You can't hear me. Sorry, I was speaking to myself and I was muted. Welcome, everybody. We'll kick off. Just some housekeeping. If you're not a speaker on this panel, can I please ask you to keep your video off and your speaker muted, and that will save us quite a bit of bandwidth. So that would be great. I have a degree of control here, so I can turn people's video on and off as appropriate. Welcome, everybody. This get together is a joint collaboration between the Radix Center for Business, Politics and Society, part of the Radix network of think tanks. The center is based in Amsterdam, but Radix originally and our Radix think tank is primarily based out of London. And we also have a youth wing that brings in 16 to 24-year-olds. And we've recently in the UK merged with another organization called Big Tent, the Big Tent Foundation, which will give us a lot more cross-party convening power. So we're very pleased about that. So thank you for joining. We have this, so as I mentioned, this is a collaborative venture between Radix and the Council on Economic Policies. Alexander, thank you so much for all your help in setting this up and the discussions that we had to get to this point. So thank you very much. I don't know if you want to say a couple of words about the center. No?
All good. Looking forward to the conversation here.
Great. Okay, well, let's kick off. Central banks. If we dial back to say 10 years or 5 years even before, maybe even a year before the great financial crash, nobody paid much attention to central banks. They were sitting quietly doing their business without much aggravation and you know, quietly getting on with their technical analysis and their monetary policies. But the great financial crash changed all that. And it seems to me that a lot of heavy lifting was thrown onto central bankers, fairly or unfairly, and they started intervening very dramatically in our economies. And since that time, since 2008, it looks like we can't open a newspaper, certainly not a financial newspaper, without reading about what central bankers are doing, and inevitably with lots of dispute and argument about whether they're doing the right thing or whether they're doing the wrong thing. But central banks have essentially come out of the shadows, which is something that I personally welcome, and are, you know, increasingly asked to explain their actions and their impacts. And that's what we want to address today. What is the role of the new role of central bank in our societies and our financial system? It's already been broadened very dramatically. Their impact on people's livelihoods is now very visible. And there are arguments that suggest that their role, or at least what they consider in how they discharge their role, should take a much broader view than maybe has been normal in the past. So that's the question that the broad question, framing of the broad question that we want to address today. I'm hoping that we won't all be in violent agreement. I hope that we can surface some debate and alternative perspectives. But we've got a very eminent panel. Those of you who received the mailings will know about. I won't introduce everybody at once, but I'll introduce people as I ask them to say something. So we'll start with Leon Wansleben, who is at the Max Planck Institute for the Study of Societies. And Leon is a sociologist by background. And although whenever I speak to him, he clearly knows a lot more economics than I do, and probably a lot more economics than some economists. But Leon takes a sociological perspective on central banks. What is I'd like to ask, and we should all look out for his book that's about to come out sometime soon about central banks. And I'd like to ask Leon to kick off here by giving us his perspective on, in today's world, and maybe tomorrow's world, who knows, what is your view about really the role of central banks in our political economy? Over to you, Leon.
Thank you very much, Joe, for this kind introduction. Okay, I'm a sociologist and academic, which partly means that I try to take a step back and look at the phenomenon of central banks with a slightly more broader canvas and a bit more historical context. So I would say, and I look very much forward to the debate with the others, that really central banks have moved to the center of attention and have become much more important for two core reasons. I mean, it's clear that they have become more influential, or they became more influential after the 1970s because of the inflationary crises in Western capitalisms. But I think that this factor, the problem of inflation, actually became much less salient in the 1990s. And what then happened, I think, is twofold. First, it became apparent, particularly in the Anglo-Saxon countries, that central banks actually are very powerful macroeconomic policymakers who are not just good at, making sure that prices remain stable, but are actually more efficient or effective in managing the economy more broadly. And this has to do with financialization, as I would put it. I just want to give two indications of this. One is that there is this very important paper on the so-called Fed put. The Fed put is a policy introduced in the mid-1990s, which essentially means that the Federal Reserve reacted to drops in asset prices, primarily stock markets, with lowering its interest rates. Why did the Fed do that? Because it realized that drops in asset prices influence consumption, private household consumption negatively, and therefore reducing interest rates was a good way to stabilize the economy in response to these financial market shocks. We have similar evidence actually from the United Kingdom, where the Bank of England realized in 1990 that because households became ever more indebted, movements in interest rates are the most powerful tool of economic policy making. So that's I think one important element of the story, is that central banks are not just there to fight inflation. Since the 1990s, they have become core macroeconomic policymakers. And that, I think, is associated with the growing importance of finance. The second reason why central banks are very powerful and important these days is because they have a singular, inalienable role in forestalling systemic breakdowns of an increasingly large and fragile financial system, especially one where the shadow banking part is growing. Again, I think there is pretty straightforward support for that. 2008 crisis is, of course, one. Adam Tooze wrote, I think, an 800-page book on why central banks are essential for addressing crises like the ones we've seen in 2008. But then there is also more recent research on the COVID crisis. And I guess particularly Karen will know that the Federal Reserve in March 2020 bought treasuries, US government bonds of $1 trillion in volume. Why? Because large parts of the shadow banking sector needed cash, and the central bank, the American central bank, just had to respond to that to maintain stability. And so that's another reason, I think, why central banks have become so important and essential, is because financial systems are inherently fragile and they are pro-cyclical, and you need essentially a firefighter, as central banks are, because they essentially can print endless money to address liquidity crises. and to act as so-called dealers of last resort. And that makes central banks essential systemic stabilizers in a growing, in an economy where the financial sectors are large and fragile and pro-cyclical. Okay, so I think the point I want to make here is, context is important. We can discuss mandates and we can discuss, what central banks should or shouldn't do. But I think a core driver of the role of central banks are macroeconomic developments, particularly the growing role of finance and the essential role that central banks play towards financial sectors, which make them so important these days. And a lot of the other mandates or issues that you can address central banks with are then add-ons to these essential structural roles that central banks play in contemporary economies. Shall I leave it at that for now, Joe? Come back to the points later, maybe?
Yes, that's fine. Thank you very much, Leon. That's a great way to start. I'll move over to Senior now. Leon looks at these things from the outside in as an academic, but you have to be down in the trenches actually doing things. Senior is a governor of the Danish National Bank and has previously worked at the IMF and at the Swiss National Bank, so comes with a lot of experience. And it's notable, I looked on the Danish Bank's website, and it says that you have three main objectives, which is ensure stable prices, safe payments, and a stable financial system. And I think, as Leon has just pointed out, you can more or less include all sorts of activities under those three main objectives. But the website also makes the point about the central bank being self-governing and independent. And the question here, I guess, is, given Leon's comment that central banks are now major players in macroeconomic policy, how do you guys think about your role in that, and how do you think about interactions with other government policy, be it fiscal policy, environmental policy, distribution of wealth, etc.? And to what extent should we be having a discussion about the appropriate nature of this wonderful phrase, central bank independence, given the really pretty wide issues that central banks now get involved in, many of which have significant political consequences? Over to you, Sini.
Those were a lot of issues. So first, thanks so much for having me on this panel, and thanks to Leon, who I think summarized many of the ways in which central banks are involved in the economy very well. Of course, I see also strong limitations to how we can affect the economy, and we have very specific tools that are useful in very specific ways, and that is mainly driving how we act. So let me say thanks for summarizing our mandate, and state up front that we implement the price stability part of our mandate. We implement that through a fixed exchange rate regime, and that means that we use our policy interest rate with that sole purpose of securing the peg. And that also means that we don't have that interest rate or monetary policy to use for other policy goals. Other policy goals, such as macroeconomic stabilization in Denmark, that is the responsibility of government, parliament, using fiscal regulatory tools. So we don't use monetary policy in that way in Denmark. We also see that this exchange rate policy has served Denmark very well, because it has been a part of it is a cornerstone of very sound macroeconomic management in Denmark. It's also seen that way. It has been successful. We also see our contribution to sound economic management as a contribution towards
other goals. If we take the example of climate policy, the transition will require some hard policy choices, and it will require political attention. And we think that a robust, sound macroeconomy without imbalances, without disruptions, is going to be a big contribution toward getting the political attention toward solving these goals using fiscal regulatory tools, for instance. We, of course, look toward other issues. So we have price stability as a mandate. We also have financial stability and secure payments. But if we focus on the price stability mandates, what we see that as securing a stable, robust macroeconomy. And a stable, robust macroeconomy is influenced by many things. And it is in this way that we take into account many of these other policy goals. So we have a clear mandate on a robust macroeconomy. We know that that is already and will increasingly be influenced by climate change, by the transition. And these are things that we need to take into account because of our mandate. Not on the side of our mandate, but because of our mandate. And we do that by increasingly looking at how climate change is affecting our economies, our financial markets. We're doing a lot of analysis of this. This is a relatively new area for central banks. We are collaborating internationally in understanding these issues better. We're doing stress testing of the financial system. We're also taking this into account in how we invest our foreign exchange reserves. We have a big foreign exchange reserve because we have a pegged exchange rate. And a natural thing in investing our foreign exchange reserves is, beside liquidity, credit conditions, considerations, returns considerations, we also look at risk. And naturally, climate risk or other types of risks will be taken into account there. The challenge here is, of course, how we measure these new types of risks and whether we have the right data and the right transparency to do so. Beyond that, we also have guidelines for responsible investing, and that is, our guidelines state that we should not be investing our foreign exchange reserves into activities that are significantly and systematically involved in activities that Parliament or government oppose as reflected in international agreements. Here we are focused on the international agreements because our foreign exchange reserve is, of course, not invested in Denmark, but in international assets. We are compliant with the UN Global Compact, and we have a new goal of also being consistent or aligned with the Paris Agreement. This is work in progress because it's very hard both to define what is Paris alignment and how do you actually implement that given all the restrictions that we have. But this is a work in progress and a clear aim that we have. And then, of course, all these societal goals are relevant for our own carbon footprint. We are part of the authorities in Denmark. We are part of Denmark. We have goals. Again, the example is the climate transition. And we need to see what is our role in that as an organization, as an entity in Denmark. And we are currently looking into how we measure our own carbon footprint, what kinds of goals should we have there. We are collaborating and even chairing an international working group in how to define better how central banks should measure their carbon footprints and what kinds of goals they should have. So those are some overall considerations. They are specific here, climate change, but I think we have very similar considerations when it comes to, for instance, inequality. And I'll stop here, and I'm sure there will be many follow-ups during the panel.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Signe. That was a great and clear explanation of how you think about these things. We might press you a bit later on how you do it in practice in terms of coordination with the fiscal authorities and how that ties in with independent, in inverted commas, decision making. But I'll now pass on to Alexander. And Alexander, you've long argued that central banks should, in their policy decisions, their monetary policy decisions, and their financial regulatory decisions, take much more notice of issues like climate change and other policy issues inequality or whatever. Senior mentioned how the Danish bank looks at that with regards to foreign exchange. I've kind of sidestepped how one might look at it in making investments or buying assets under quantitative easing programs, which is a substantial amount of money. So let me pass on to you, Alexander, as to your view of how central banks should discharge their role in an environmentally and socially responsible way, and balancing that with the needs of financial markets and financial stability.
Thank you very much, Joe, and thank you all for this conversation. I'm really looking forward to it. I think it's an absolutely urgent topic, because to just give you the very short answer to your question, Joe, in a nutshell, I think the narrative around central banking that we got into in the early 90s, that I think Leon also alluded to, got us onto a wrong track. It increasingly narrowed down our view on what central banks are about, up to the point that in many countries we are now essentially saying they are to safeguard price stability and do nothing else. And I believe that doesn't do justice neither to what they should do, nor actually to what they're doing. I think it is misaligned with reality of central banking. Central banking have a much broader array of responsibilities. Karen, for example, will very well and much better than I do know the many responsibilities that the Fed has beyond price stability, also beyond financial stability, including, for example, community investments, payment systems. I saw earlier someone bringing up the question of stable coins. So the whole area of cryptocurrencies and new currencies, where central banks play a critical role in deciding steps forward. And I think all of these questions that are now being put on the agenda of central banks cannot and are not answered by an exclusive lens on price stability. They have much broader implications, and I think central banks are very well aware of that. Now, maybe taking briefly the what I think is a great illustration of climate change as an example there. It's an example of the broad array of topics that central banks are already paying attention to. And I think it's also a great example of the two different narratives that central banks have based their actions on over the last few years. And I think what Sina described is actually a description of both of them. So one part is the risk narrative, where central banks rightfully say that climate risks are financial risks, and as such need to be addressed by central banks, both in their role as safeguarding financial stability, as well as where they hold assets on their balance sheets, their duty, their fiduciary duty, to ensure that the assets they purchase do not pose risks to their balance sheet and thus ultimately to society. Similarly, in their role as financial supervisors, central banks obviously also have a duty to account for climate risks as financial risks when they supervise banks and when they seek to ensure that these banks have adequate capital to address the risks that they face, including those from climate change. So that is, I think, a narrative that is very well positioned within the existing narrative of a narrow mandate of central banks. And I think it's under this narrative that a lot of the action has taken place. But at the same time, as Sina mentioned, increasingly we've seen alignment between what central banks do and broader policy objectives. I think, Sina, you mentioned Paris alignment hitting your agenda. So I think this moves beyond that risk narrative to the broader narrative around policy coherence, as the title of this session refers to, where central banks are increasingly asked to ensure that what they do is aligned with the broader objectives that the societies they serve have, whether that's on social issues or environmental issues. And I think that's where the discussion is now heading to, where it needs to head to. And maybe just to end, I also believe that that push for more policy coherence in many cases is even already embedded in existing mandates. I'm not saying that we should have that conversation being restricted by existing mandates. I think we should have that conversation thinking what should be the role of central banks, and if the role goes beyond existing mandates, we should have a discussion on whether these mandates can be changed. But I think in reality, many mandates already cover for such a broader role. And I'm in that context very encouraged by seeing that the secondary mandate, for example, of the ECB, which basically says, without prejudice to the objective of price stability, the European system of central banks shall support the economic policies in the Union and the objectives as listed in the treaties, which then include all the types of objectives that are on the agenda here in this conversation, including social coherence, cohesion, and environmental tasks. That this is now moving up the agenda also at the ECB, and that ECB representatives over the last few months have actually been saying this is a duty, not an option. And I think that's the direction we need to take in this conversation. Thanks, Joe.
Thank you, Alex. That's great. Thank you for putting it in such a clear framework. I'd like to pass on to move on to Karen now. And Karen is a managing partner of Federal Financial Analytics and has written a book with a very interesting title, and I'm sure very interesting content, Engine of Inequality, the Fed and the Future of Wealth in America. And of course, today we've just heard that Jerome Powell has just been reappointed as chair of the Fed. So I wonder whether that means it's business as usual. But Karen, maybe you can tell us a little bit about your views on the role of the Fed and central banks, why you feel they're an engine of inequality, and what they should do about it. In that, what kind of, because it's very easy, or not easy, but there's a real challenge in central bankers trying to balance objectives that might push them in opposite directions. And there's a judgment to be made on that. And there's an additional question, which is, have central banks, particularly in the States and maybe also in the UK with big financial sectors, have become primarily captured by financial markets rather than by the needs of the real economy. So over to you, Karen.
Thank you very much. And it's a pleasure to be part of this panel and learn so much already from my fellow panelists. As you said, Joe, I'm managing partner of a firm called Federal Financial Analytics. And in my day job, we advise large global financial institutions and central banks on the strategic and market impact of their policies. And I began to feel in 2015, 2016, as we were working with our clients on issues related to the unintended consequences of the post-2008 bank, financial, but particularly bank regulatory regime. It's just, perhaps coincidentally, I was reading Thomas Piketty's Capitalism in the 21st Century as we were doing a massive project on how the capital and liquidity rules intersected with monetary policy and why the growth was so slow and why banks, particularly in the United States, were redefining their model. And I really felt that economic inequality was staring out in like neon letters as we worked through this much more technical analysis. And this was in 2016, we were doing the bulk of this work. And of course, the US presidential election was going on. And it was very much at the time when the Federal Reserve under Janet Yellen and in the Obama administration, their description of the United States economy was a, quote, good place, in quotes. The Fed said that consistently. And indeed, even in May of 2020, the head of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, despite the COVID, despite the macroeconomic, the United States was a, quote, good place. Well, voters didn't think so. it really struck me the difference between that central bank perception of economic prosperity and the on-the-ground experience of many Americans. Black Americans stayed home in the 2016 election because the economy wasn't a good place for them. Less educated white men came to the polls and told, by virtue of voting for Donald Trump, how angry they were. And while it was a narrow election, it was a very angry one. And it was very clear voters said this economy was not a good place. And so, although it wasn't my day job, I really decided to try to think hard about why that was, what was going on. In the one area of economic policy one could do a great deal about very quickly, which is monetary policy. You don't need Congress, our dysfunctional Congress, to act through the overt fiscal challenges. You need the Fed to recognize its unintended, but I now think profound inequality impact and start to act on it. And so that's why nights and weekends and whenever I could, my late husband and I worked on this book, which came out in March of this year. I think in talking about the role of central banks and economic inequality, I'd like to focus on the Fed in my comments, because one of the conclusions I've reached is that it's difficult to generalize. I think the ECB has been particularly good. The Fed, I should back up. The Fed has said it has no inequality impact. Absolutely not. Jay Powell was actually questioned about some of the conclusions of my book at a recent congressional hearing. He got much more angry than usual, pounded on the table. No, 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 there's no inequality impact. And if there is, it's up to fiscal policy to clean it up. Mark Carney said that much more explicitly. He said that monetary policy does has distributional impact, but it's up to fiscal policy to clean up after it. And in the United States, you can really see that disconnect between monetary and fiscal policy. For example, in sharp difference between Europe and the UK, the United States, most Americans, in fact, almost 95% of mortgages in the United States are fixed rate mortgages. They're 30 years fixed rate loans. So the interest rate channel through which lowering rates immediately alters the cash position and the demand capacity, the propensity to consume of most households that you can see in the EU and in the UK doesn't happen in the United States. The Americans can only lower their cost of mortgage finance by refinancing. And we have seen, and I've written a bit about this, that interestingly, mortgage refinances are much more likely for upper income white Americans than for lower income Black Americans, even if the lower income Black household has a solid credit score. So between the fixed rate mortgages and the inherent implicit discrimination left in the American financial system, interest rates don't have the positive economic equality benefit in the United States as they do in other nations. And you also see many other effects of Federal Reserve policy, particularly the portfolio, having profound impact on our particularly financialized economy, and an economy in which the shadow banking system is far more important than it is, say, in the EU. In the United States, non-banks account for 80% of corporate credit, versus in the EU, it's the reverse. Banks do 80% of corporate credit. So you can see it's huge differences in how the systems work, despite all the seeming commonality. And therefore, the inequality transmission channels in the United States, I think, are particularly strong. Now, how does that relate to the Fed's mission? As I said, Jay Powell and the Fed as an institution says it has a, quote, dual mandate of maximum employment, I quote, and price stability, quote, quote. If, however, you look at the Federal Reserve Act, you will see it has a third mandate, quote, moderate long-term interest rates, quote, quote. The Fed has ignored those for many years on the grounds that if it achieves maximum employment and price stability and it pats itself on the back, it's done so, or it did so until inflation took off this year. Moderate interest rates have to be a part of that. Now, how it can reconcile its charter with rates that have been persistently negative in real terms since 2008 and well after the economy was in a, quote, good place, I have no idea. So the Fed's charter is already a good deal more complex than it likes to talk about. But if you push a little bit farther and look more deeply at the Fed's mandate, you also see that the Fed comes under a broader mandate expressed in the Full Employment Act as amended in the 1977 Humphrey-Hawkins Act. And under that act, the federal government as a whole is charged with an array of government policy objectives, all of which are aimed, and here again I quote, the general welfare. And the Federal Reserve is specifically and expressly told to act in coordination with that broader mandate for the federal government in fiscal policy of enhancing general welfare. And we've seen instead, and I think Leon's point about financialized economy is very apt here, what the Fed has done is support the financial parts of that economy. Its financial stability mandate, which is not expressed in law, but indirectly and very strongly placed within the Fed's ambit, has made it focus principally on markets, not on the extent to which prosperity is shared and consumption is financed by income rather than debt. In the United States now, households below 50% income median have debt of 173% of their durable, non-mortgage debt, of 173% of their durable assets. How the economy is very badly skewed. Supporting the financial market gains, increases wealth inequality, but you see also significant adverse impacts on income equality. But the sheer scope of the Fed's policy has made it de facto fiscal. I just actually presented a paper at a monetary policy conference in the United States here on Thursday. So update, if you'd like to look more at these mandate questions that I discuss in my book, as well as my view on the Fed's fiscal role, please take a look at that paper, which you can find up on my firm's website. But I tried to show that the Fed has major fiscal impact. One, its portfolio, now $8.7 trillion, is almost a third of US GDP. It monetizes the government debt, and the Fed allocates credit. It said, no, we had to climate risk. We can't have any climate-related direct investments. But the Fed bought huge amounts of corporate debt in March of 2020, including even junk bond ETFs. It said in 2016 that corporate debt wasn't part of its charter, and all of a sudden it was. Now, it's chosen to hold the bulk of that portfolio in Treasury obligations and housing-related bonds, the agency paper, but that has created a huge run-up in upper-income housing by virtue, again, of the nature of the fixed-rate mortgage and the refinancing structure of American housing finance. The Fed allocates credit. The Fed also, by creating ultra-low interest rates, has turned Treasury obligations into the equivalent of a new form of money in the financial system. And think of a new paper from the BIS on this topic is very provocative and really worth a read. And finally, the Fed is fiscal because its role in the economy is so huge, domestic and global, that it outguns fiscal policy. One of the really important lessons of Piketty's book on economic inequality is that inequality is cumulative. The richer you get, the poorer you are, the poorer you get, unless policy breaks that engine. That's why I called my book Engine of Inequality. And the nature of the Fed's intercessions and how fast they act in the market has outgunned fiscal policy. We're working now in the United States on legislation to do things like long overdue reforms to primary education. That's all great. By the time the kids who get the benefit of that start to enter the workforce in 25 years, they'll be even farther behind. Our intergenerational mobility is shameful. So the Fed has really distorted the nature of money in the United States economy in favor of those who have it. And I think it's rather unsurprising that those who don't are very angry about the nature of this economic engine and how far it's leaving them behind. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Karen. Fascinating. The somewhat different world in the States than that what some of us are used to in some European countries, but the principles, I think, still apply. And thanks for that explanation. I'll pass on to Panicos now. Panicos used to be governor of the Central Bank of Cyprus and on the governing council of the European Central Bank, and also a professor of financial economics at Leicester University. So we can get back to you, Panicos, when we come up with some more technical questions. And the European Central Bank is, let's put it this way, a bit of an unusual animal. It doesn't have a single government to answer to. And therefore, changing its mandate or modifying its mandate is extremely difficult. It's needs treaty change, which is, these days probably almost impossible in Europe. And Alexander mentioned that part of the mandate is to take notice of the economic policies or the policies within the Union, the economic policies within the Union. But the Union is made up of 27 countries, each with different economic policies. So taking account of 27 potentially disparate perspectives on life must be quite a challenge. So the ECB is in a very unusual and somewhat difficult position. And the concept that we're discussing today of policy coherence is a bit of a challenge for the central bank, the European Central Bank, to follow, because which policy, whose policy, and how. So, taking climate change into account, do you support, let's say, the policy of Germany, or do you suppose the policy of Poland? So over to you, Panicos. Maybe you can share with us how these difficulties and challenges and different perspectives are handled by the European Central Bank.
Thank you. Thank you, Joe. And it's a pleasure and an honor to be in this very distinguished panel. And I've also learned a lot by listening to the previous speakers, especially about the United States, the critique of the United States, and lots of thoughts about that, but lots of thoughts. In some sense, Europe is simpler, but in another sense, it's more complicated. Now, I've had the benefit on Europe of working with another think tank, a few other people, on this precisely your question, the secondary mandate, which is vague, right? I mean, the secondary mandate states that we shall support the general economic policies in the Union with a view to contributing to the achievement of the objectives of the Union as laid down in Article 3 of the Treaty on the European Union. So this is, you can't be much more vague than that. But on the other hand, because all these people I've worked with have thought about it very, very carefully, and I'm kind of a little bit of a free rider of this, what we propose, and this comes from the Positive Money Europe, Stan Jourdan, I think he's there among the audience, so he can control me if I say something wrong, but also Bruegel, the Bruegel think tank. So there is a contribution there that went out not even a year ago, maybe 6 months ago, on how to sort of work on the secondary objective, which is, I understand the question here, right? And it's not to go to individual governments, right? It's to go to the parliament, right? Is to sort of not negotiate. I mean, although we're saying this letter take guidance from parliament, I would put it even more lightly, but enter discussions with parliament, right? The European Parliament, right? And the council, right? The highest level. So listen to them, basically. What are these policies? right? Because the alternative of the governing council sitting together and saying, we've got to do something about that because it's not an option anymore, it's a duty, right? Which is quite rightly so, as Alexander has said. I don't think that's enough. I think they really need to take the views of the parliament, with the elected representatives, and the council, again, elected representatives of the people. And then they have to form independently what they should be doing about the secondary mandate. But again, it should be independent after they listened to what the general policies of the general, not the individual country policies are. So there is a way forward, I think, on that. And that way forward, I think it's been made more possible with the change of leadership, and on this with Madame Lagarde, I think. And I think this is where actually a change of leadership does help, because after sort of so many years of Mario Draghi, the fact that Madame Lagarde came in, many economists criticized, by the way, at the time, because she's not an economist, she's not a central banker. But personally, I said, I welcome that, because that's exactly what I felt was needed at this point in time. Somebody who is not so determined to defend all the past, that has happened in central banking, because some of it is good, but some of it may not be so good, right? So I thought it was a good opportunity. And then we had the strategy review at the ECB, which I thought was very good. So I have confidence in the ECB at the minute, that they are moving with the times, right? And at the same time, I can see that they are respecting the independence, because that's also very important. I mean, although you said it's a word, I wrote a book about it, okay, central bank independence, and I think it's at the heart of the union, the independence of the central bank. Without it, I think things and politicians and parliament, and they may be the best elected representatives, but inevitably they have the short horizons, right? And those short horizons sometimes can cause issues with inflation, and that's why we have the rise of central bank independence, right? If you look at history, as Leon quite rightly alluded to, we went into inflation targeting because of the failures of monetary targeting and monetarism in the UK, in the US, etc. And as part of that new framework, inflation targeting, central banks are meant to be independent, because that really means basically it's a free lunch. It's lower inflation without more unemployment. And I think we've had that plus, that free lunch. But also it means we respond to shocks as they come, because within inflation targeting, you actually do respond to shocks. So I'm not quite in agreement with Leon that it had to be, the responses that we've seen were to do with simply somebody decided to, sorry, sorry, I need to switch this off. Yeah.
There's nothing to stop.
Oh, now all my technology is coming to life, and my Siri says there's nothing to stop here. Anyway, sorry about that. So the story is that with inflation targeting, you respond to shocks. You don't just simply look at price stability. Price stability is your medium-term objective, but it means you still have to respond to shocks. So those shocks could come from the financial markets. So it's quite legitimate to respond to those shocks, right? And this is what we've seen central banks to be doing. They were responding to shocks as and when they came in. And they could be real shocks, they could be COVID, they could be, but they could also be financial shocks, right? And that's consistent with this price stability medium-term objective. So there's nothing wrong with that. That there are unintended consequences, I have no doubt that there are unintended consequences. And there have been. And they have to do with inequality when you're buying assets, right? And especially if you're buying private sector assets, you're raising the prices of those assets. So you're making some people richer. I mean, that's almost goes without saying. I don't need like a very serious econometric studies to be convinced that those actions, the QE in particular, large-scale asset purchases, would inevitably have some long-term consequences. On the other hand, when Karen says about households discrimination in the mortgage market in the US. I think that's not. I wouldn't consider that an issue of the Fed. I would consider that an issue with basically social policy, discrimination. If the banks are discriminating, I think this is what you have to hit. It's the banks, the credit system. I don't think it is fair to blame the Fed. I'm not an advocate of the Fed, but I think on that issue, on discrimination, that favors white sort of upper middle class people in the mortgage market, I'm not sure it's the Fed that needs to do that. So there's a whole range of issues, and very important issues, and social cohesion, inequality is a discussion that central banks should be having, right, with the elected representatives of the people. But ultimately, they should be independently deciding their policies, which should be ideally consistent and with those objectives, right? And in Europe, I think it is possible to use intelligently that secondary objective of the ECB, in fact, to enhance the legitimacy of the ECB, right? But I stand corrected by Stan, who is in the audience, if I've said something not quite what was meant to be said on the political guidance on the secondary objective. So with that, I think I'll pause, but I can come back to it. I had the privilege of listening to everyone, so I could just comment on a little bit on everyone's contributions already. Thanks.
Thank you, Panicos. Well, that was a great first round. So let's see what we can dig out for the second round. And I'd like to start with Leon again about this touchy issue of what I consider somewhat unhelpful shorthand, this phrase, central bank independence, which really doesn't capture a lot of nuance of what it's supposed to mean. So, at one end, we have Denmark, which is a very well-run, very organized, not huge country with a relatively high level of social cohesion. On the other hand, we have the European Central Bank with this mandate spanning, multiple cultures and multiple belief systems. And listening to Panicos, one of my bugbears, I kind of wonder about the European Parliament as an institution and the extent to which it really reflects the democratic will of the different European populations. And then we have the US, where, unlike Europe, the issue of what central bank independence should mean and how has been the subject of a lot of political debate over the years, with very many, with both parties, both of the main parties, debating this in a lot of depth and at a lot of length. Whereas in Europe, to some extent, it's kind of almost taken as a religion that cannot be challenged or cannot even be discussed in public. So Leon, from your sort of social perspective, how should we be thinking about what central bank independence should mean? I mean, we've heard from Karen that essentially they're affecting fiscal policy to a large extent, not just through their big bazookas. So this phrase, central bank independence, that everybody wants, not everybody, well, the central bankers want to defend, and politicians also want to defend, or at least maintain the semblance of defending it because it gives credibility. How should we be looking at this? How should we be discussing it? What are the issues?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, there's a lot of interesting issues that came up, but I try to get to your question. I agree with this, and I also agree with looking at certain political economies and understanding both the structural and institutional particularities. And this, of course, also stretches to the issue of what central bank independence essentially means. Just as to add to that, to what was already said, I think there is a fundamental difference between, for instance, the independence of the German Bundesbank of the 70s, 80s, and the kind of independence that we see of the European Central Bank, but also the Federal Reserve or the Bank of England. The Bundesbank was independent as what I call a kind of autonomous but very embedded actor in a corporatist economy. And so one of the major sources of power of the Bundesbank was not its constitutional status. It didn't have a strong constitutional status. Actually, its independence could have been abandoned with just a simple change of a law, just a majority. But it had a strong independence in the sense that corporatist institutions and government and the general public had great respect for this particular organization. And so it was able to orchestrate these different actors in the economy, particularly the unions, employers, government, around its stability objectives. Interestingly enough, macroeconomic expertise, technocracy, so to say, played a very minor role in this. The Bundesbank wasn't very sophisticated with its economics. The combination of, independence as a way to manage market expectations, financial market expectations, and to use sophisticated models and forecasts to do so is a very different version of independence. And I think the champion here, for example, in the UK is Mervyn King, who came into the Bank of England in the early 90s and essentially introduced inflation targeting by suggesting that the Bank of England should publish its own inflation reports. And then you have this connection between the Bank of England becoming what we call an epistemic authority. So the Bank of England had the better expertise. And then the movement towards operational independence, which happened in 1998, as a way in which the central bank, the Bank of England, could use its expertise to signal to the markets here, this is what we do and why we do it. And the way in which markets would respond would make sense from the viewpoint of macroeconomic policy. So then you have independence essentially also as a tool to coordinate financial markets and monetary policy. So complicated answer, I just suggest you are very right that there's very different models of independence. I've just concentrated on two aspects of this. And of course, they also reflect political culture, as you rightly say. I mean, in the US, the Fed is an institution of Congress, and that has major implications for its maneuvering and the way in which it tries to avoid becoming too accountable in these political battles. There is a very good new paper on this, which essentially shows the governor, who is the sole person, the chairman, I should say, of the Fed, who is the sole person going to Congress to kind of report, actually, and the congressmen, they talk past each other. So if you kind of do a text analysis of their discourse, Jerome Powell speaks about one issue, Congress about loads of other issues, but there is hardly any connect, which is maybe a kind of way in which what was called the defunct political system in the US and the peculiar independence of the Fed kind of interact in weird ways.
Thank you, Leon. Senior, I mean, I have the impression of Denmark as being this nice cohesive place where everybody works together and there is a kind of consensus culture that emerges, and I don't know whether that is a fantasy or whether that is real, and if it has some degree of reality, then probably your ability to coordinate with political priorities and general policy directions is easier than it might be for some other countries. Is that fair to say? And maybe you can explain to us, in the practicalities of how it happens, while you no doubt jealously preserve whatever your understanding of independence might be.
Let me say that you are partly right. Now I see Denmark also a bit from the outside, because I have worked internationally for many years, and Denmark is a small country with a lot of cohesion, and it is relatively easy to coordinate for that reason. But I can assure you there are also political squabbles inside Denmark. The Danish central bank monetary policy regime and independence goes back to the early 80s, where in the 70s we were not this beacon of strong macroeconomic management. We in fact had high inflation, high unemployment. We were using devaluations as a stabilization tool, but they were not working because they were expected. We had high indexation of wages. That means that we were creating inflation through devaluations, and it would go into wages, and we would produce more inflation, and so on and so forth. And I think this is a really important background. And let me say more generally that there is a historical reasons why we now have the model, which consists of a clear mandate for central banks, independence, operational independence in meeting that mandate, and accountability. And it goes back to a lot of historical experiences with the use of monetary policy for political gain, for short-term gain, for special interests, which often has resulted in problems of financial instability and price instability. And so whether we are in the right, now we have the right trade-off between all these considerations, I don't know, but we have to remember the historical context, and we really have to be careful not to throw out the baby with the bathwater and go back to issues and problems that we had historically. I also wanted to mention that going back to Karen and also Panica, some of the comments you had, yes, central banks are inherently fiscal, and we should not forget that. And this is no secret. When the central bank makes a profit, this is transferred to the to the government. And so when central banks have operations that are costly, there will be less profits transferred to the government, and vice versa. So there is a clear link to the budget. It is not independent from the government budget at all. And this is also one of the reasons and one of the problems that we have tried to guard against with a clear mandate and independence, is for politicians to not see this as a tool for revenue. So that is the extreme case, is when central banks have been used as a tool for revenue, has resulted in a lot of problems. And I also want to just take my time, now that I have time on air, to mention that, yes, central banks are operating on the interest rate, and there is a link from interest rate to asset prices. And so when central banks are reducing interest rates, it boosts asset prices. And when people that have higher fortunes also hold more assets, then a boosting of asset prices increases inequality. And this is something that there has been a lot of focus on. And I think I just want to mention that this focus in normal times, that would be business cycle dependent. So we would have periods of time where interest rates are increased and you would have asset prices falling. And you would have periods of time where interest rates are reduced and you would have asset prices increasing. And over the business cycle, this should even out this impact on inequality. Now we've been in a situation for 30 years where we had structural declines in interest rates. We haven't had a big focus on that, but that means that interest rates, central banks have been reducing interest rates just in order not to be tightening monetary policy, to be following structural interest rates down. And at the same time, we've had this long increase in asset prices. And so there has been this has been connected to a structural increase in inequality in as much as in societies where it's primarily more wealthy people that are holding the assets. And I think that this is a huge issue that there should be a focus on. I am in agreement with the idea that this is a structural fiscal issue, and this is a political issue that central banks cannot solve. Let me stop there.
Thank you, Signe. Alex, I want to get back to the climate change issue, because we've drifted a little bit to fiscal policy and other stuff, but I want to get back to the climate change issue. And I believe as you outlined earlier, you have two arguments as to why the central banks should take the climate change issue seriously. First of all, of course, because it is a serious issue, but they should take it seriously, both for policy coherence terms and for financial risk terms. And I would add to that, maybe there's a symbolic element that, if central banks come out explicitly doing something about climate change, that's an important symbolic message, given their position in our social and economic structures. So the question for you is the risk narrative, given the size of the balance sheets on central banks, is the risk narrative associated with climate change real? Is it substantial? Or in the context, and I don't even know what risk means on a central bank balance sheet, but maybe Panicos might be able to enlighten us about that. Is it substantial enough for central banks to be worried about it, or is the climate narrative primarily a policy coherence issue?
So I think it is, and it must be both. As I said, it started with the risk narrative, and I think that is now pretty much uncontested. Central banks around the world have identified climate risk as a material risk. They are following processes to ensure that they mitigate against any risks on their balance sheet. In the case of the ECB, they use ratings for that. Central banks have said the ratings we use do not sufficiently account for these risks. So in my view, they are actually, to put it provocatively, in breach of their fiduciary duty by not acting on their diagnosis that they're using ratings that do not sufficiently account for risks that they've themselves identified as being material. Similarly, if we look at what they're doing on the financial supervisory side, they are out there saying this is a material risk both for individual banks as well as from a systemic perspective. And actually the ECB just yesterday released its latest findings on how banks prepared, and they're basically saying they're unprepared. And this is a risk. They see it in increased default probabilities. And so for me, this is like uncontested, has to happen. And I'm actually very concerned about the time that has already elapsed between central bankers 5 years ago saying this is a risk, and central banks today still being focused on diagnosis rather than taking action, both through introducing higher capital requirements to address these risks and also to reflect it on their own balance sheet. But on top of that, indeed, I also believe there is an important policy coherence aspect, and I'm happy that some central banks have taken this up. The ECB is an example, the Bank of England is another one. If I may, Joe, let me take that opportunity to just bring up another two broader issues that have been addressed. So I think that we should not have this discussion starting from existing mandates. Many of my fellow panelists here have alluded to the history of central banking and how over time the view on what the purpose is of central banks has changed to reflect developments in the broader context. And I think we're at that time again, where we need to review what is the ultimate purpose of central banks, what are the instruments that we therefore give into their toolbox? And only then, what are the institutional implications that these instruments require for them to deploy them? And with that, I also believe that what often happens, starting the conversation from the starting point of independence, is taking this conversation backwards. Because we first need to understand what is the purpose, what are the instruments, and then we can have a conversation about the degree of independence that central banks require to deploy these instruments. And then, and then I stop, we need to have that conversation in a much more granular way. Currently, we're saying central bank independence, and that's supposed to address the entire conversation, but it doesn't. First of all, central banks, as we all said, have different responsibilities. And as Sina alluded to, the notion of independence came specifically with regard to its role in guiding monetary policy and securing price stability. But that's a very different thing than for a central bank to have a role with regard to financial stability. I would even go a step further. I think there are certain parts of a decision in central bank instruments, let's say the size of its balance sheet, where a central bank definitely needs independence, but I'm not so sure that it needs that same degree of independence, for example, in what it invests that balance sheet into. To give an example, if the Swiss parliament were to tell the Swiss National Bank, there are some limitations in terms of what you can invest the 1 trillion Swiss francs on your balance sheet into, I do not think that this would limit the central bank's ability to safeguard price stability, as long as it has the ability to determine the size of its balance sheet. So I think we need to be much more granular on that discussion moving forward.
Thank you very much, Alexander. In 2016, when we set up Radix, our first paper was called Quantitative Easing, the debate that never happened. And we argued that, you know, what central banks were doing at that time, quantitative easing, required a political debate, and the definition, our shared understanding of the nature and limits of central bank independence also required more discussion and granular debate, as Alexander has just said. And at that time, we were roundly condemned and shot at from all sides because we dared suggest that there should be a more open debate about what central bank independence should mean. So anyway, now we're 5 years later, and I think we're inching towards being able at least to have the discussion. So I'd like to move back to Karen. There's a question from the audience here that maybe you can, Kevin Langford suggests that the reason that central banks, including the Fed, might have gone down this route of asset purchases and everything else, which drive further inequality, is because they have a limited tool set. There's not really much else that is available to them. So what can they do? And the question, the second part of the question is, will this likely change if we start introducing central bank digital currencies?
It's a great question, and I benefited a lot from the discussion. Again, I just first would like to clarify one thing, because I know, Panicos, you took issue with something I said about the question of racial inequity when it comes to U.S. mortgage finance. And I cited that just importantly, I thought, to try to show how low interest rates don't flow equitably through the U.S. economy in the same way that they do, at least more so, in the EU. But it is also actually, I think, important to recognize that the Fed, while it is not the arbiter of the fair lending laws, it is a very important enforcement authority in the United States in the anti-discrimination law books. Some of that has been transferred to something called the Bureau of Consumer Financial Protection. But the Fed has direct authority, as do the other bank regulatory agencies over credit discrimination. And it also is a critical agent in setting the rules for the Community Reinvestment Act, which define the extent to which banks are encouraged, if not required, to invest in low and moderate income communities. So it has, again, back to the issue of it, those are, quote, regulatory duties, but they have a lot of fiscal impact. I'd also would just like to comment, everyone I think has said, well, yeah, of course, when the Fed interest rates go down and or it holds large amounts of assets, a central bank does that, it exacerbates wealth inequality. And there's a sort of, and we all know that, well, I have to say the Fed doesn't. And go back, and I know this because, as I said, Jay Powell was directly questioned about my book, which concludes and focuses it both on wealth and income inequality. But he was directly asked, does the Fed's portfolio, do the actions you take, do ultra low rates increase US wealth inequality? And he said, absolutely not. And it's the responsibility of fiscal power to address equality and equity, not that of the central bank. So I think the understanding that I believe many of, if not all of us on this panel share, is not yet recognized yet at the Fed, which I think is unfortunate because it will make more mistakes as a result. To the question from the floor about the Fed's toolkit and the role of CBDC, I think I would first say that if the Fed's, quote, toolkit isn't sufficient to ensure monetary policy transmission in an equitable way that enhances shared prosperity, it should say so. What it's done instead is use those tools in ways, I think, never intended by Congress, never even contemplated by the central bank, in this never-ending chase. And there are more tools I didn't discuss. I mean, the Fed has had a heck of a time trying to keep rates down at short-term floors. It uses something it never thought it needed until it desperately got Congress to authorize this in 2008, interest on bank reserves held at the Fed, trying to put a floor under rates to prevent nominal negative rates in the United States. That's not working, partly because of the huge size of the money market funds, the quote, shadow banking industry. So the Fed now has the overnight reverse repurchase facility that was $1.7 trillion just a couple of months ago, supporting the money market funds, another effort to put a floor under the floor on short-term rates. It's making stuff up. And most of it's not working. Again, and distorting the economy in very profound ways with, I think, obvious adverse political consequences, but I also think long-term and destructive structural ones.
Thank you, Karen. Panicos, let me bring you in for a minute. There's a question from the audience here about the purpose of central banks and what their shareholders expect from them, whoever that might. But I'd like to get into a bit of a more technical discussion, because we talked about risk, we talked about policy, we talked about the burgeoning size of central bank balance sheets, and Alexander mentioned the concept of, this is public money, and therefore central banks should look at the risk associated with it. So a lot of this money is essentially created. And can you explain to us a little bit, what does risk mean on a central bank balance sheet? Because here we have institutions that essentially, it's very hard for them to go bankrupt. They can issue as much money as they want, or at least that's the impression from lay people like me. So the concept of risk of a central bank balance sheet, as a financial economist as well as a central banker, what on earth does it mean?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So I'll tell you how I perceived it. And that's pretty horrific way of perceiving that risk, because it is pretty real. Because yes, you can print money in some sense under certain rules, but you can't print that money to recapitalize yourself, right? In order for that, for capital to go into a central bank, Parliament, government first, and then a parliament has to approve it. That's how I understand it, right? Say a central bank theoretically goes bankrupt. What is the next step? Obviously, it can't go bankrupt. It's going to go to the government and say, look, I've gone bankrupt because I've invested, say, in the crisis. Let's go back. Completely hypothetical scenario.
Yes.
Say the Central Bank of Cyprus invested in Irish bonds during the crisis, and say, completely hypothetical again, Ireland, not Greece, went out of the euro, went bankrupt. and then I look at my balance sheet and I say, oh goodness, this is a huge loss. It wiped out all my capital. It wiped out all my buffers. What do I do? As far as I understand it, I have to go to the Cyprus government and beg for them to recapitalize me. And of course, they have to do it because they need a central bank. But then they might start asking questions about me, the governor, and my governing board. How come you made all these losses, right? And then my position becomes untenable. That's why it's so horrific, right? So it's very real. If a central bank governor is seen to be responsible for losses, then I'd say that their position is untenable, right? It means they haven't managed the risk. So it's very much the same as it would be in a normal shareholder organization, right? And shareholders are the governments. But of course, governments are accountable to parliament. So the whole political system would just come after me, right? So I don't want that to happen, right? It's as simple as that. So financial risk is pretty serious for central banks. So central banks tend to be very, very risk averse for that, very conservative with risk. I'm not entirely sure everyone on boards of the central bank understand this risk, but they're certainly, and I've seen it with my very own eyes, very, very risk conscious. And of course, then you have the auditors who come in and do your accounts, and they have to, the external auditors, they have to highlight your risks, right? And they could be coming from any kind of, even from, if you're providing liquidity support to banks, do you have enough collateral to be doing that? And then you start thinking, well, if it's a systemic bank, it collapses, the whole economy can go, basically. What is the definition of risk there? That is more, that's more when I become Keynesian and I say there's two equilibria. I say to accountants, there's a bad equilibrium and a good equilibrium. The bad equilibrium is that if we do nothing, then you can bet we have financial meltdown and everything, including the central bank goes. The good equilibrium is one where we provide that liquidity support, we get out of this crisis, and of course we recognize there are some risks, but I can't really articulate them very well, because if it's a systemic bank that fails, the whole system will melt down, right? So I like to play Keynesian when I'm in those difficult situations, right, with multiple equilibria, right? And I always choose the good equilibrium, right? So I don't know if I've answered your question. I try to be a little light.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Thank you so much. Leon, you have a comment.
I just wanted to bring some of the points together and maybe evoke a little bit of controversy at the very end. So, I mean, for me, it seems, particularly from the things that Karen said, that we haven't really been achieving a critical evaluation of what central banks have already done in the last couple of years, right? Particularly in two areas. One is QE with its distributional implications and distorting effects on the macroeconomy. And the other one is in the realm of financial stabilization or financial stability, where the reaction of central banks is essentially asymmetric, right? If a crash happens, they bail markets out, but there is no proper regulation on the upswing. And so I think these are two essential problems with what central banks are already doing. And my fear is a little bit that adding to the mandates in that situation is risky. I mean, I'm completely in favor of policy coherence. I'm completely in favor of kind of making sure that in general, what central banks do corresponds to general consensus policy positions in the particular countries or in currency areas. But it's quite another thing to say, well, we want central banks to actively pursue climate policy. We want central banks to actively pursue other objectives. And we don't even know how to create accountability for that, let alone critically assess what they do. And given that my view is central banks ultimately will rely on finance, the primary benefit of all of this will go to finance. I mean, if central banks do climate change policy, it's climate change policy via financial markets, de-risking some parts of investment, maybe banning other parts. But then again, we have a financial market-driven climate change policy. And I think that's not the avenue to go. So I'd be curious to know. I'm completely, again, I'm not against policy coherence. I think what Alexander said makes perfect sense. You ban certain assets to be purchased by a central bank, but I'm not that in favor of expanding the proactive central bank policy making that we've already seen during the last years and which had major problematic implications.
Yeah. Good. I'll open it up. Panicos put his hand up first and then Alexander.
To be honest, I won't be controversial. In fact, I will agree with Leon. I would be very reluctant to open up the complete sort of can of worms, if you like. Let's rethink central banks completely now from scratch. And I just don't see, I mean, even in practical terms, the EU treaty took like, we have to redo the EU treaty. I mean, can you imagine that happening in Europe? It just can't happen. There's a danger. The danger is on the independence. I think Signe mentioned it. There's good reason for independence in relation to monetary policy, in relation to price stability. It's very hard to justify it for other things. Yes, we can think about that, and we can refine that, but I don't think we can do major changes of the treaty because it's just practically impossible. And then my question to Alexander is the following. Do we trust the current, say, political leadership around the world that they could come up with the right answers at this moment in time? I mean, why is this the right moment to rethink central banks? Personally, I have great distrust in politicians. I see politicians very much looking at their short-term political ambitions, political horizons. And I fear that any long-term considerations, in fact, if we have anything that we benefited from central banks, is that they maybe went beyond their duties, partly because they cared about longer-term considerations. That may have come from price stability, but in the end, they protected a lot more besides. They kept the euro together, right? I mean, let's not forget that the euro was our friend Mario Draghi and the governing council of the ECB and the ECB itself. They worked very hard. I think you could criticize them for going beyond and above and beyond the call of duty, but very much in the public interest. I mean, Mario occasionally said it, and in fact, I completely agreed with him. The euro is a project for peace. Maybe the central bank shouldn't say that, right, strictly speaking, because they're there for price stability, not for peace. But my goodness, I mean, let's think of history, right? You want an institution to think like that, to be like that, to think and behave long term. And I don't think we can, although the ECB may have made some mistakes in the Troika, etc., little interventions perhaps with Greece or with not, there have been criticism of it, but on balance, even with all the unintended consequences of QE, they have achieved the major objective, which was to keep Europe together, and Europe strong, and Europe is, let's not forget, a project for peace. Thank you.
Pass on to Alexander, but an interesting comment, Panicos, about trusting politicians and central banks taking decisions in the public interest. And it's difficult for me to understand how we define the public interest without political input. But anyway, Alexander.
And I'm conscious of time, so just quickly, yes. I mean, Leon, thanks for opening up like the platform for round 2 of this conversation, right? This will take us another few hours. But just quickly, first of all, I don't think that the topic of policy coherence is like it sounded a bit binary, right? I think it's on a continuum on how much proactiveness we seek. I think we're also on a continuum in terms of having primary and secondary goals. You know, I'm not advocating for saying all of these goals need to be on par, but I do advocate for central banks to pay attention to them and to understand what the implications are of the alternative options that they may choose. And Panicos, on your point, indeed, changing the treaty is probably nearly impossible, but I think the ECB, in contrast to what people say about the ECB, is for me one of the prime examples where the mandate is actually already in place to be policy coherent. It's in the treaty, it's in that secondary objective. So I think the conversation that we can't change the ECB treaty is a bit theoretical, because exactly with the ECB, we're already at the point where there is, as I would argue, and the ECB itself has argued, a duty to take these issues into account. So I think we need to have that conversation. I think we need to get real about what central banks already do and the implications they have. And it's way beyond price stability. And therefore, it requires a longer debate. And I think we're at a point like in the 90s where the institutions governing finance play a different role, are in a different context. And we need to review where we are and then define the next steps forward. Thanks, Joe.
Thanks, Alex. We're coming to the end of our time. We're a little bit over time. So I'd just like to, at this point, just open up to the panel and say, does anybody have a burning desire to make some final comments based on where we've got to so far? Senior, looks like she's moving.
Just say I somehow missed the connection, so I think I missed a good chunk of your conversation, and I'm really sorry about that, because it has been incredibly interesting to follow all your points, and I learned a lot. I wanted to say that before we all conclude that central banks have been increasing inequality, I think that before I sign off on that, I want to say that the reality is so much more complicated than that. Asset prices is one way that central banks affect inequality, but central banks are also affecting inequality by supporting unemployment. And it's in this respect that central banks will often say the outcome is not clear. We cannot just raise interest rates and put down asset prices and there increase equality, because we would create a lot of unemployment. So it is a lot more complex. And then I wanted to say that we should be mindful in this discussion of what tools the central bank has. And Alexander was touching on that. When we look at what we expect central banks to achieve, we also need to look at what tools they will apply to do so. And when you look at the tools of central banks, they create money, they set interest rates on that money, and they can deliver liquidity. If you want central banks to achieve goals that are more than the number of tools they have, you will immediately have trade-offs between these goals, and we should be very mindful of that. And this is back to the history of why it is that we got very specific about the concrete mandates that central banks have and the operational independence to achieve those. So those would be my final words on that.
Thank you very much. Well, Karen, do you have a comment?
I just want a quick point, and then I know we're very close on time, and I absolutely agree. One, that this is inequality is very complex. I said before, it has to be looked nationally. But I would point out on the employment issue, which is a huge one in the United States, in the Fed, what is maximum, what is sometimes full employment, which is Charter says. It's not just the numbers, you have to also look at wages. You know, in the United States in 1990, a truck driver earned a nominal, in real terms, $120,000. Today, that same truck driver earns $43,000. Now, he has a job. He kept his job. But again, is the central bank fully, what is income equality? Is it employment only, or do wages count? And what about capital income? So again, it's really complicated, but I don't think it's enough to say, well, yeah, it's bad wealth equality, but okay, good income equality, and it all kind of balances out, hopefully, across the business cycle, which you're right, it hasn't, and I fear very much it won't. And if, again, I maybe with my U.S. perspective, if these are central bank independence is the least of it. Political stability. If this country, the United States, becomes more acutely economically unequal, even if central banking is only a part of that problem, and it is only a part of the problem, we have, as a matter of policy urgency, to address it, because the consequences will not be good if we don't.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, everybody. Thanks to the audience for joining us. I hope you found it interesting. I certainly found it fascinating. Thank you, everybody, for making the time and joining us, and for educating me about so many things. Hopefully, Alex, we can think about organizing some kind of follow-up to this at some stage, because I'm sure there's lots of other things to talk about. Thank you all, and have a great evening.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.